He didn't knock. He didn't announce. He approached in silence like those who had been trained to erase problems, not confront them. They hired him because you were too composed, too unshaken, too immune to the predictable chessboard of reaction. They assumed you were a flaw in the code, a glitch to be corrected. They paid a man who prided himself on eliminating anomalies. What they didn't tell him was that you had already stepped beyond the algorithm. You weren't the kind of danger you could aim at. You were the kind of threat that infected timelines. And when he came close enough to study the rhythm of your breath, he realized he wasn't hunting a person. He was staring into something ancient, something awake. The room was still, yet it vibrated with a tension he couldn't locate. You didn't speak, and yet the silence wrapped around his neck like a question he couldn't answer. He'd handled sociopaths, killed visionaries, disarmed revolutionaries, but you weren't a man. You were a mirror no one survived standing in front of, not because of what it showed, but because of what it forced people to admit. There was no bravado in your posture, no false charisma to draw attention, just a soul that had chewed through its own darkness and come out not clean, but holy. He wasn't afraid of your strength. He was terrified of your stillness, because only those who've made peace with destruction carry that kind of silence. He saw something in your eyes he had never prepared for. Not rage, not revenge, not arrogance. He saw completion. You weren't driven by need anymore. You weren't seeking answers or victories. You weren't here to win. You were here to end cycles. You were the conclusion they kept rewriting the story to avoid. And now you sat across from him, knowing exactly who sent him, knowing exactly what he came for, and offering him no reaction, no fear, no plea, just awareness. That was the fatal weapon, not your hands, not your words. Your knowing you saw through him, through the layers of programming he had been given, through the armor of his identity, and you didn't blink. He tried to talk. They always do. Tried to reduce you to a file, a mission, a contract. But every syllable he uttered sounded absurd in the weight of that room, because you weren't shaped by the surface anymore. You didn't live in the realm of impressions. You lived in the marrow. And what he saw when he tried to engage was that you were already 10 moves beyond him. You weren't defending yourself. You were watching him implode under the weight of trying to categorize you. He came for blood, but left haunted by a truth he couldn't articulate. That's the power of becoming unreadable. He saw the patterns unravel, saw how every move he was taught to anticipate had no bearing in your presence. Because you didn't follow conflict with escalation. You followed it with silence. You didn't respond to provocation with performance. You responded with absence. Every psychological trick meant to destabilize you fell flat. You didn't need to fight for control. You had mastered self-governance. You were proof that nothing external holds true power unless invited. That truth shredded his training from the inside out, because now he wasn't just failing the mission, he was questioning the mission itself. That's what scared him. Not the failure, the awakening. In you, he didn't find an opponent. He found a void, one that reflected his own emptiness. He came to finish you. But what he found was someone who had already buried their past, someone who had already faced the assassins of the soul and come out purified, not polished. You had no weak point because you had no identity left for him to aim at. You had killed every version of yourself that was killable. That made you invincible, not in body, but in meaning. You no longer needed to survive. You had already won by refusing to break the way they expected you to. You offered no warning, no explanation. You simply watched as the man began to feel something he wasn't trained to process. Irrelevance. He had never failed a mission before. But this wasn't failure. This was transformation. He left without a word, without a threat. Because there's no counterstrike against someone who doesn't flinch when confronted. You showed him what happens when evolution happens in private. When growth is done not to impress, but to transcend. You didn't become stronger to defeat anyone. You became unshakable to finally become yourself. That is what he feared. That he'd been sent to erase someone who had already erased every chain they thought would hold you. They expected a fight. What they triggered instead was a funeral, for the version of you they hoped still existed. The one who used to explain. The one who used to justify. the one who used to soften their blows with understanding. That version was already buried. What remained was someone who didn't posture, didn't plead, didn't retaliate, just stared through them with the kind of eyes that make men confess. And that's what broke him. He wasn't prepared for a confrontation with his own fiction. You didn't have to defeat him. You forced him to meet himself and realize how hollow he'd become in service of hollow masters. They heard nothing back, no update, no confirmation. The man they paid returned a different shape, quieter haunted. Less man, more aftermath. You didn't just survive, you converted him. And that's why you're dangerous. Because the people who come to harm you often leave changed. Not because you inflict pain, but because you awaken it. You made him see that true strength is not about who you can kill. It's about who you've already buried within yourself. And when that truth lands, it shifts timelines. They prepared for muscle, for retaliation, for the kind of violence that comes with raised voices and clenched fists. But when they approached, what unsettled them wasn't aggression. It was the absence of tension. You weren't poised to strike. You weren't animated. You weren't boiling with fury. You were still, cold, quiet. And that stillness, they didn't know what to do with it. Because it wasn't empty, it was loaded, charged with a presence so composed. It made everything loud in them feel ridiculous. You didn't need to bark or threaten. Your mere posture announced one thing. They had already lost. Not because you overpowered them, but because you weren't afraid of them. That's what ruined their equation. Most people broadcast their fear in their eyes, their posture, their voice when they speak too quickly, or when they explain things that don't need explaining. You carried no such tells, no excuses, no hesitation. They poked. They tried to stir a flinch, a twitch, anything to remind themselves you were still human. But you weren't playing human anymore. You had evolved into something else. Something so rooted, it felt immovable. You weren't concerned about the outcome. That's what rattled them. You didn't enter the arena hoping to win. You entered it as someone who had nothing left to lose, nothing left to protect, and nothing left to explain. You were the final version of someone who had walked through every fire and come out with ashes in their veins instead of blood. They couldn't find footing with you. Every psychological trap they laid was designed to trigger ego, insecurity, desperation. But those systems had already died in you. You weren't holding on to reputation. You weren't holding on to narratives. You had let it all rot and rebuild itself from beneath the ground of your former self. That's what made you unpredictable. You weren't acting out of emotion. You were acting out of clarity. Cold clarity. The kind that doesn't tremble under pressure because it doesn't perceive pressure at all. You weren't pretending to be fearless. You simply no longer registered their presence as a threat worth reacting to. People fear what they can't control. And there is no one more uncontrollable than the one who's no longer driven by fear. That's the variable they forgot to plan for. They thought if they intimidated you, they could contain you. If they shamed you, they could redirect you. If they humiliated you, they could fracture you. But all those tactics rely on the target still caring about perception. You didn't. You weren't driven by survival anymore. You were driven by purpose. And purpose, when purified through pain, doesn't panic. It just proceeds. They started to feel it in their hands first, that subtle tremor. Then in their throat, words came out slower, heavier. Because when a person who expected a battlefield walks into a temple, they begin to question their weapons. They realize the fight wasn't outside. It had never been. The fight was internal. And you had already won that war. That was the true threat. Not your ability to strike, but your ability to absorb, analyze, and remain unmoved. You didn't blink when challenged. You blinked when bored. What really terrified them was how you didn't chase resolution. You didn't seek to correct their misconceptions. You didn't play the games they baited you into. You just stood still. And in that stillness, they began to disintegrate. Because people who are used to being feared don't know how to handle someone immune to their intimidation. Their dominance is performative. It relies on audience engagement. But you were no longer in their audience. You had left the theater entirely. And once the performance lost its crowd, it stopped feeling powerful. It started feeling pathetic. You became a mirror they weren't ready to see themselves in, and your stillness didn't offer them distortion. It reflected them cleanly, without filters, without mercy. That's what true power looks like. Not domination, not volume, but presence. The kind of presence that makes people shrink not because you demanded it, but because they suddenly saw the falseness of their own persona in your reflection. You didn't expose them with your words. You exposed them by existing. And that's a kind of power that doesn't require defense. They began to realize you weren't operating from the same layer of reality. While they were still entangled in appearances, narratives, and consequences, you were somewhere above it, watching. Moving with a kind of precision that wasn't rushed by urgency or distorted by validation seeking. You had transcended fear because you had digested it, sat with it, let it take its best shot, and when it failed to kill you, you didn't celebrate. You simply moved on, quieter, sharper, untouchable. That scared them more than rage ever could. They sent him like they send all amateurs with bloodlust and borrowed cause, whispered promises of a quick payday, and a legacy forged by removing what they couldn't control. His mind was trained to chase movement, to stalk the upright, the visible, the noisy. He was looking for someone standing on a stage, spotlit by their own ego. He was expecting a showman, a fighter, a loud soul waiting to clash. But you weren't standing. You weren't visible. You weren't even near the coordinates they gave him. You had long been rooted, embedded deep beneath noise, deeper than their metrics could calculate. He came for a knockdown, fists ready, eyes hunting for momentum to break. But he found stillness, a presence so unmoved it felt geological. Not a man, a monument. They never studied your silence, only your absence. They read your pauses as hesitation. They mistook your unannounced exits as fear. They thought you left the stage because the lights got too hot. They never once considered that you were never on the stage to begin with. You were under it, below it, beneath the planks and wires they'd wired to trap you. Rooted like an old system, slow, deliberate, unseen, but present, always present. And while they chased illusions, you were fortifying, not a castle, not armor, something older. Something that doesn't crumble when confronted. Trees don't panic when wind approaches. They flex, but they do not fall. You didn't grow branches to look impressive. You grew roots to become immovable. He approached with speed, trained in momentum and chaos. But his weaponry relied on recoil, and recoil needs impact. You didn't give him any. No rise to bait him, no flash to dazzle him. You were calm, still watching. His tools were forged for the restless. You were designed for drought. That's what broke him. You didn't evade, you absorbed. You let every assumption pass through you without a flinch. He kept striking, but there was no surface, just depth. Layer after layer of understanding so ancient, it collapsed his framework entirely. You weren't playing defense. You had outlived the very idea of offense. That's what roots do. They hold the land together while storms try to rewrite its shape. He was taught to cut legs from beneath those who dared rise, but you had no legs exposed. You weren't upright. You were anchored. They forgot to tell him that you weren't propped up by applause or fueled by outrage. You weren't holding a pose. You were holding principles, embedded into every grain of who you became when no one clapped, when no one watched. He expected blood. You gave him indifference. And in that indifference, he bled, internally, ego hemorrhaging with every failed calculation. Because nothing unnerves a man trained for violence more than realizing the opponent is not a man. It's a force, a frequency, one he can't reach with bullets or fists or mind games. They hired a saboteur, but he arrived at a temple, one built not with bricks but with discipline, with patience, with years of quiet, brutal internal war. And he couldn't find the cracks, because what you'd built wasn't theatrical, it was spiritual. The foundation wasn't hardened by pride. It was cemented with scars, the kind that never show. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't make a case. You didn't even ask why, because you already knew the answer. They feared you not because of your actions, but because they knew your roots were spreading, quietly, under their systems, under their facades. under every illusion they swore couldn't be broken. And now here you were, still, silent, unshakable. He left differently. Not because he failed, but because he discovered something they hadn't prepared him for. A target with no kill switch, no collapse point. You'd made yourself in such a way that there was nothing to strike that didn't regenerate, nothing to sever that didn't regrow. You weren't standing in defiance. You were growing in defiance, and growth, slow, silent, relentless, is the scariest enemy of all. He saw that. Saw the inevitable nature of you, the way your presence signaled permanence. Not arrogance, not resistance, permanence. And in that moment, he understood that you could not be removed, only respected. He didn't report back the way they expected. No victory call, no evidence. Just a quiet retreat, not out of shame, but reverence. They don't speak of it now, but they felt it, the shift. The realization that the person they tried to eliminate had become elemental. Untouchable not because you hid, but because you dug in. You made peace with obscurity. You trained under pressure. You didn't shout when hurt. You wrote scriptures in your mind, carved rituals into your patience, and let time do the talking. And now they're left talking to themselves because you no longer attend the meetings. You no longer engage in their language. Their mistake wasn't in thinking you were dangerous. It was in assuming you needed a stage to be lethal. They forgot about the kind of power that grows in basements, the kind that refuses to bloom until it can't be stopped. You didn't wait for permission. You didn't ask to be seen. You just built, slowly, until the foundation was so deep, even earthquakes bowed. They came for the demolition. They left realizing the building was underground, that the walls weren't external, they were internal. Hardened by choices no one knew you were making in silence. And by the time they understood that it was too late, they promised him a man, told him you were flesh, nerves, history, told him you were fallible, told him there was blood to spill, fears to exploit, cracks to widen. He accepted the job thinking he'd face another product of the world, just another man trying to play strong. What they didn't tell him, what they couldn't know, was that he was stepping into a storm that had already destroyed its own center. He came to deliver a conclusion, but found no beginning, no clean narrative, just chaos sharpened into consciousness. You had burned through every layer of yourself until nothing remained but presence, dense, cold, and unpredictable. Not rage, not defense. Something older. Something that could not be provoked because it had already devoured its own triggers. You weren't standing for anything. You were standing through everything. The distinction unraveled him, because a man standing for a cause is still tied to something, still has an endpoint, still holds something sacred enough to be used against him. But you stood through betrayal, through character assassinations, through emotional draughts, through hope's erosion. You stood through not as survival, but as evolution. He kept searching for the man he was sent to kill, but the coordinates didn't align. He saw no fear, no hunger for retaliation, no bruised pride, just stillness. You were the aftermath of every storm he'd never studied. There was no eye to find, no walls to breach, only a frequency that had already collapsed and rebuilt itself from silence. He tried to locate your rhythm, expecting flinches or patterns. But storms like you don't move predictably. You swirl, you observe, you disorient without trying. And in that disorientation, he lost his sense of power. He realized that your chaos was not wild, it was structured. Your madness was not erratic, it was resolved. You had already fought yourself, already buried the weaker versions. He came to break something that no longer existed. He arrived with weapons made for men still tethered to identity, but your identity had drowned long ago. What remained was refined, steel without shine, fury without noise. And that unnerved him far more than any show of strength ever could. They failed to tell him what kind of ruin you had made peace with. They sent him to slay a ghost that had already seen its own death. He circled your presence, trying to extract signals, provoke an opening. But every step closer made him feel smaller. He hadn't walked into a confrontation. He'd walked into consequence. He wasn't facing resistance. He He was staring at retribution that didn't announce itself. There's something ancient in a soul that has suffered cleanly, without narrating every injury, without dramatizing every scar. You didn't need to win. You simply couldn't lose. Because the war you were hired out of was never external. It had already played out beneath your ribs, in nights where sleep was outlawed by thought, and clarity was bought with internal screams. He wasn't ready for someone who had grieved their old self so thoroughly that there was no trace left to manipulate. Your stillness didn't read as peace to him. It read as the final version of someone who no longer negotiates with fear. He threw words meant to provoke, but they fell through you like stones tossed into a bottomless well. No echo, no splash, just distance. You didn't interrupt. You didn't perform. You allowed his projection to collapse on its own. Because what lives inside you now has no need to announce its endurance. The silence around you wasn't the absence of noise. It was the presence of command, not over others, over self. He tried to adapt, tried to switch tones. Manipulators do that when their first strategy fails. But every angle revealed the same truth. There was no leverage. Because there was no attachment. You didn't care for his approval, or his fear, or his perception. He was armed with pressure, but pressure only breaks things built for appearance. You were built to last, to withstand, to echo. You became his mirror, and what he saw in reflection was his own smallness. Not because you minimized him, but because your depth swallowed his expectations like wind swallows a whisper. There's a cruelty in that kind of silence, one that breaks egos with no touch. He began to realize he was the one exposed. You hadn't moved, hadn't defended, hadn't retaliated, yet somehow he was unraveling. That's what happens when a predator steps into the energy of someone who already dissected their own darkness. You held no shame for your past, no fantasy about your future. You simply were fully. And that being, without performance, without pretense, was lethal. It broke his framework. He couldn't figure out why the room felt heavier, why his hands trembled slightly, why his thoughts slowed down around you. He was facing gravity, not a person. Gravity shaped by internal wars that would have collapsed him if he had lived them. He reported back to them, what little he could, but words failed. How do you explain to cowards that the target has transcended targeting? That the storm no longer cares for destruction, because it already destroyed itself, studied the wreckage, and built a throne from it. They expected a wounded ego to mock, a man on edge. They got something else. They got aftermath given form. They got a being forged not in glory, but in silence, in nights that left bones hollow and reborn. You didn't flinch because you had nothing left to flinch with. He left understanding you weren't even looking at him. You were looking through him. Now they sit together, in rooms they think are private, trying to rationalize your evolution. They come as story for flaws, for signs of exaggeration, but deep down they know. He didn't fail because he was weak. He failed because you weren't reachable. You had no handles, no switches, no impulses they could manipulate. You'd burned that part of yourself in the fires they never survived. They still speak in tactics. You move in principles. They function through masks. You operate from soul. And now the one thing they fear most isn't your strength. It's that there's no version of themselves that could survive what made you.